He sat at the head of the table and never stood again. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from today? I always look forward to hearing from you. Here we go. It was a Tuesday afternoon, which meant it had rained. I was bored, and Nero Wolfe was trying to pretend I wasn't in the room. He was in his chair, of course, the one built like a throne for a king with no kingdom beyond the carpet borders of his own office. He was sipping beer with a look on his face that meant he was thinking about either food or orchids, which meant he was unavailable for anything else, including conversation, crime, or civilization. I had just returned from the corner delicatessen with a half-pound of sliced mortadella, which Fritz hadn't requested but I'd decided to rescue from neglect, when the front doorbell rang. I glanced at Wolfe. No reaction. No twitch. No grunt. No lift of the eyebrow. That's the thing with Wolfe. He could win a poker game against the Sphinx. I shrugged and went to the door. Standing on the stoop was a woman with a coat too expensive for the weather and eyes that had made up their mind 5 years ago not to be surprised by anything again. She had that curated kind of stillness, like someone who spends time around expensive things that break easily. A tall man hovered just behind her, built like a sommelier with secrets. "I'm looking for Mr. Wolfe," she said. "The detective." "You found him?" I said. "But what you get is me first. I'm Archie Goodwin." "State your business, miss." "Contessa Lucia Varela." Well, that explained the coat. "He'll see you," I said, and stepped aside. Not because Wolfe had told me he would, but because I had already decided he was about to. When a Contessa shows up unannounced in full designer war paint with a manservant who looks like he knows 50 ways to remove a cork and 10 ways to silence a witness, Nero Wolfe doesn't get veto power on curiosity. In the office, Wolfe didn't rise, he never does, but he did open his eyes a millimeter wider, which in his language meant, "You have 10 seconds to justify your existence." He stayed silent as I ushered the pair in. "Mr. Wolfe," I said, "may I present Contessa Lucia Varela and the gentleman who hasn't introduced himself yet." The tall man stepped forward and gave a slight bow. "Gianni, I work with the Contessa." That could have meant anything from sous chef to personal assassin. I decided to let Wolfe figure it out. Wolfe gave the slightest of nods, which for him was practically a hug. The Contessa didn't sit right away. She looked around the office slowly, at the globe, the bookshelves, the safe in the corner. When her eyes landed on the chair in front of Wolfe's desk, she folded into it like a question mark with impeccable posture. "I understand," she said, "that you're a man of principle and appetite." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. "Madame, I dislike flattery and food-based metaphor. I'm neither a gourmand to be buttered nor a trout to be baited. What do you want?" Gianni shifted his weight slightly. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was the kind of movement that made you think he'd practiced it in mirrors. The Contessa took a deep breath. 3 nights ago, during a private tasting at La Carnière, Wolfe's eyes opened again. Chef Carl Mancuso's new venture. Precisely. Wolfe didn't grunt, but I swear the air shifted slightly around him. La Carnière was the most exclusive dining experience in Manhattan since someone got the idea to charge $300 for a plate you couldn't pronounce and weren't allowed to photograph. Carl Mancuso was the chef behind it, a man who considered foie gras a medium of expression and once reportedly fired a waiter for sneezing near a duck confit. "I was at the chef's table," she said. "Carl prepared a 7-course seasonal interpretation. There were 6 of us. A financier, a food critic, an actress, a museum director, myself, and—" "Someone died?" I offered. "Number worse," she said. "Someone lived, but changed." That wasn't the answer I expected. Neither did Wolfe, apparently. He didn't speak, but his head tilted back against the headrest a few degrees, which was the equivalent of me dropping a coffee cup. "Carl," she said, "collapsed halfway through dessert. It wasn't public and it didn't make the papers. He survived, but he hasn't spoken a word since. He refuses to cook. He locked himself in his apartment and sent a note to his sous chef. The table was poisoned." Wolfe let out a long breath through his nose, like a volcano negotiating a peace treaty. "I assume you do not refer to literal poison," he said. "I'm not sure," she said. "There was no trace in the food. No physical illness, but something happened that night, something deliberate, something cooked into the meal, or perhaps placed at the table." Wolfe looked at me, and I could already feel it coming. The shift, the faint current in the air before a thunderstorm. He was going to take the case. "I want to hire you, Mr. Wolfe," she said, "to find out what was poisoned, the food, the atmosphere, the intent. Something. Carl won't talk to me, and I'm afraid this, whatever it is, might ruin him, or me." "You are his investor?" Wolfe asked. "I'm his wife," she said. "Legally still. Emotionally. Pending." "Ah." Wolfe made a noise. "I won't attempt to spell it." "I do not investigate feelings," he said, "nor culinary superstitions." She leaned forward just a hair. "Then perhaps you'll investigate sabotage, because someone at that table wants Carl destroyed. And if you wait too long, they'll get it." Wolfe turned to me. "Archie, get names. Who was there, who wasn't, and who had the most to lose? Begin with the guest list, then the menu." I grinned. "Shall I reserve a table?" Wolfe scowled. "Don't be absurd. Bring the table to me." As the Contessa rose and handed me a slim folder, I noticed her fingers trembled. Just a little. The kind of tremble that doesn't come from nerves, but from knowing too much already. I held the door as she left. She glanced back. "Be careful, Mr. Goodwin. Carl didn't recognize the poison until it was in his mouth. You might not get the same warning." When I turned back, Wolfe was already reaching for his notebook. That meant it had begun, and I hadn't even unwrapped the mortadella. I had just closed the front door behind the Contessa and her shadow Gianni when Wolfe called my name with the tone of someone about to assign unpleasant labor, which in his case meant anything that required standing up. "Bring the folder." I walked it over. He didn't reach for it. He just stared at the manila envelope like it might leap open and sing him an aria. I opened it myself, slid the contents onto his desk, typed pages, handwritten notes, a menu printed on thick ivory cardstock, and waited while he gave it a contemptuous glance, then closed his eyes to think. "What do you make of her?" he asked, not moving. "She's either terrified or playing terrified. Hard to say, but I believe her about one thing. Someone meant harm at that table. Whether it was for Carl or through him is another matter. And Gianni? Too polished, either a butler or a bodyguard. Either way, he doesn't carry trays." That earned me a single nod. Wolfe leaned back farther in the chair, which, considering how far back he usually leans, put him somewhere around horizontal. "The poison," he murmured. "Symbolic, psychological, or sensory. This requires delicacy." "Great," I said. "Delicacy means I'll be skipping lunch." I spent the next hour phoning through the guest list. There were 6 names total from that night, excluding the chef himself, Lucia Varela, obviously. Then there was Lucien Brasher, the food critic from the Taster's Ledger, who'd once described a Chateaubriand as more emotional than edible. Joyelle Hines, who'd made her name in an indie film about a woman in love with a turntable, and who was now 3 stages past Hollywood relevance. Gordon Haycroft, director of the Metropolitan Museum's private collections and proud wearer of horn-rimmed glasses, last stylish in 1961. Nadia Chervin, financier and restaurateur, rumored to have opened half the boutique bistros in Soho on investor cash that never quite made it back to the investors. And the 6th, Dr. Haroon Patel, a soft-spoken neuroscientist with a taste for molecular gastronomy and a net worth you could mistake for a misprint. I scheduled interviews for the next morning. Wolfe, naturally, would not attend. His role in such things consists of remaining immobile and brilliant while I dodged the sharpened conversation points in Manhattan dining rooms. Fritz brought in a late lunch, veal scallopine with lemon, sautéed escarole, and a risotto so smooth it could have been ironed. Wolfe tasted everything, chewed twice, and grunted once. For him, that was high praise. "What was the dessert?" Wolfe asked suddenly between mouthfuls. I flipped back to the menu, a reinterpretation of a black walnut torte. Compressed sponge, candied rind, mascarpone cream, and something called ghost truffle vapor, which I assume means some sous chef waved a truffle over it from a different room. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Black walnut?" "Yeah." Rare. Potent. Easily overpowering. Often used to mask. Could cover bitterness. Like poison. Like betrayal." I put down my fork. "You think someone planted something in the food?" "No," Wolfe said. "That would be amateurish. Mancuso would never allow an unsanctioned ingredient. But a performance, a culinary deception, now that, perhaps." I knew the look on Wolfe's face. He wasn't thinking about food, he was thinking about artifice, the thing that dressed itself as beauty and smelled faintly of violence. Contessa Varela believes it was an emotional poison, that Carl's collapse wasn't from ingestion but from impact. And yet, Wolfe said, he was the only one affected. Unless others are hiding it. Wolfe nodded. "Precisely. You'll speak to each of them. Ascertain their relationships with Carl Mancuso, with each other, and with the Contessa. Start with Lucien Brasher. Why him? Critics are emotional assassins, and their weapons are words. If he meant to destroy Mancuso, he would do it with a dish, a glance, and a paragraph. I made the call and got lucky. Brasher was in town, writing a scathing ode to saffron overuse for the Taster's Ledger, and agreed to meet me at a cafe near Gramercy Park. He looked like the kind of man who carried 2 handkerchiefs, one for show, one for sweat. Thin, precise, and damp with superiority, he was already seated when I arrived, sipping a tea that might have had a resume. "Mr. Goodwin," he said without smiling, "I suppose you want to talk about Carl." "Yes, but not for the society pages." He sniffed. It was bound to happen. The collapse, I mean. A man can't chase that level of perfection without eventually catching a piece of himself in the machinery. "You're saying it was stress?" "I'm saying Carl was his own poison." "Then why did he write that note?" Brasher hesitated. "Because something did happen that night. The table shifted. Shifted how?" "Atmosphere. Tension. A current. Like watching a souffle fall in slow motion and realizing someone opened the oven door on purpose." "You suspect someone?" "I suspect everyone. Carl was a tyrant. Brilliant, yes. But he made enemies faster than... he made reductions." "And what about the Contessa?" Brasher took a long sip of tea, then finally met my eyes. "She didn't come for the food. She came to be seen supporting him. Lucia is no fool, but she plays one very well." That was enough to chew on. I returned to the brownstone as dusk settled in, bringing with it the city's usual chorus of honking cars, arguing neighbors, and the faint buzz of secrets hiding behind lit windows. Wolfe was back in his chair. He didn't ask what I'd found. He simply opened one eye and said, "Next. Joyelle Hines. Tomorrow. Then Shervin. Patel and Haycroft are waiting on confirmations." "Good. We will proceed." I paused. "You really think this wasn't a physical poison?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that what happened at that table was designed to look like nothing at all, which makes it far more dangerous." He reached for his beer. "Tell Fritz," he added, "no black walnuts." "Not until this is over." I nodded. I didn't blame him. Whatever had been served at that table, it had done its damage without a trace, and I had the sinking feeling that the poison hadn't finished working yet. The next morning began with Fritz's cinnamon toast and a note from Nero Wolfe. See Joyelle Hines before noon. Do not let her perform. Which, coming from Wolfe, was basically a warning that if she tried to turn our interview into a monologue about her art, I had permission to fake a fire drill. Joyelle had agreed to meet at a cafe in Tribeca that used glass tables, minimalist chairs, and enough stark white paint to make you feel like you were sitting inside an expensive hospital brochure. She arrived 12 minutes late, wearing a scarf the size of a tent and sunglasses big enough to reflect my entire childhood. She offered a hand like it was being auditioned for a role. "Mr. Goodwin, you're just as the Contessa described." "I hope that's good news," I said, shaking it. "Depends on the day, I suppose." She settled into the chair opposite me like she was posing for a magazine cover. "You want to talk about Carl?" "I do." She reached for her latte, took a sip, and sighed like someone savoring the last good memory of a failed marriage. "Carl's a genius," she said. "That's the problem. He forgets other people exist." I heard he collapsed. That's putting it kindly. He withered, like a souffle in shame. Interesting. That made 2 people in 2 days comparing the man to baked goods with emotional issues. I was sitting 2 seats to his left, she continued. Nadia was directly across from me. She barely touched her food. Gordon kept fidgeting with his napkin like it was a contract clause. Haroun, of course, was making mental notes for his next TED Talk. And Lucia kept smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. "And you?" She took off her sunglasses finally. Her eyes were sharp, amber, and too tired for someone pretending not to care. "I watched it happen," she said. "The unraveling. One moment, Carl was plating a dessert like it was a Sistine Chapel sketch. The next, he froze. Mid-gesture, spoon in the air. His hand trembled, just slightly. Then he looked at Lucia and said something under his breath. You hear it? Number. But whatever it was, it made her sit very still. She stopped smiling. Her hand went to her necklace. And then Carl turned away, walked into the back kitchen, and didn't return. I watched her for a beat. You think she triggered it? I think Lucia knows what kind of poison doesn't need to be swallowed. That brought us back to Wolfe's favorite kind, the human kind, concealed in smiles and served chilled. Did he seem unwell before that? Number, he was electric. Obsessed, of course, but precise, focused. That menu was him at his peak. Then what changed? She didn't answer for a second. Then she leaned in. Can I ask you something, Mr. Goodwin? What does it take to break a man who's already halfway to martyrdom? I didn't smile. A truth he didn't cook himself. She blinked at that once and then nodded. Careful then. If you keep talking like that, someone's going to put you on a menu. I left her there, swaddled in fabric and unfinished thought, and walked 2 blocks to a bench outside a florist's shop. Called Wolfe from a payphone? Yes, we still use them. Wolfe says smartphones are a plague and refuses to acknowledge they exist outside delivery apps. He picked up on the 3rd ring. Report. She saw it happen, I said. Or thinks she did. She's convinced Carl's breakdown was aimed squarely at Lucia. Says he muttered something just before he walked out, and he was steady until dessert. Of course, Wolfe said. Dessert is the coda. It carries the theme. That menu was a message. To whom? Find Nadia Chervin. Now. It took 3 calls and a fabricated quote from a fictitious business publication to get Nadia to agree to 10 minutes at her private office above a wine bar in Soho. When I arrived, she made me wait 15 and then told me she didn't have long because a tasting with potential verticals was starting soon, whatever that meant. Nadia was 50, taut as wire, and wore a pantsuit like it was armor. She gestured for me to sit, but didn't bother to herself. Lucia sent you? She introduced me to the case, yes. But Wolfe is his own species. Good, she said, because I have no sympathy for Lucia. Why's that? Because she let Carl unravel, and she watched it happen with the same smile she wears to galas and funerals. Seems to be a pattern, I said. That smile. She's not cruel, Mr. Goodwin. She's calculated. She measures her moves the way Carl measured salt. No more, no less. She knew exactly what that dinner meant to him. And what did it mean to you? An investment check. If he succeeded, I floated 6 brand extensions. If he failed, she shrugged. He failed. You think he was sabotaged? I think Carl was too arrogant to see how many people were sharpening knives around him. Figuratively. Mostly. She smiled then, but it didn't warm the room. It felt like someone had just shut a vault. Did you notice anything strange that night? I asked. A moment, a gesture, a comment. Only that Carl served a dessert he hadn't tested. That was unusual. Why? Because he never improvised on the last course. It was always the signature. Which means something changed his plan, or someone did. That got my antennae up. What was the original dessert? She considered. Caramelized fig tart with saffron tuile and goat cheese ice cream. I saw it on a draft menu a week prior. And what did we get? Black walnut. Ghost truffle. A completely different flavor profile. And no one said anything? Only Lucia. She murmured, "He's changed it." Just like that. Nadia gave me a long look, like someone watching a chess move she didn't expect. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe didn't look up when I entered. He was rereading the menu again like it owed him money. 2 desserts, he said, before I could speak. 1 planned. 1 served. Right. And only Lucia noticed. No, Wolfe said. Only Lucia admitted it. That stopped me. Everyone at that table had a reason to want Carl humiliated or broken. Brasher for the reviews, Joyelle for the past, Nadia for the future. But only one person knew the dessert had changed. Which means one of 2 things. Either she helped change it, or she made sure everyone else noticed. Wolfe set the menu down, finally. We are no longer looking for poison, Archie. We are looking for performance, and Carl Mancuso was the audience. I sat, finally feeling the pieces nudged together. You think Lucia staged something? At the table? For him? I think, Wolfe said, that what happened was rehearsed, and the final act begins with our next guest. Gordon Haycroft. Wolfe nodded. The museum man. He'll understand composition, context, and he will tell you who framed the dish. As I reached for the phone to make the call, Wolfe added, and Archie, eat nothing he offers. Which, considering Haycroft once called olive oil a colonialist invention, I had no trouble agreeing with. Wolfe's warning about not eating anything offered by Gordon Haycroft was unnecessary. I'd met museum types before. Fussy men who treat a canapé like it's a message from God and a mislabeled sarcophagus like a personal betrayal. But Haycroft took it to a new level. His secretary ushered me into an office at the top floor of the Met's administrative wing that smelled like parchment, lemon polish, and old money. Haycroft himself stood beside a window, looking out over Central Park with the somber reverence of a man convinced nature was mostly ornamental. He turned as I approached, adjusted his horn-rimmed glasses, and offered a handshake that felt like being pressed between 2 pieces of archival foam. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "I assume you're here in connection with Carl's unfortunate episode." "That's one way to phrase it," I said. "Another is, something went rotten at the chef's table, and I don't mean the cheese." Haycroft didn't smile. I didn't expect him to. "I've already told Lucia everything I know," he said, which frankly isn't much. The meal was exquisite. The company was eclectic, meaning strained. meaning tense. Carl was under pressure. Lucia was performative. Brasher was insufferable, but that's not news. Nadia had her usual air of transactional menace. Joyelle was attempting to channel dizzy ingenue, but lacked the innocence. And Dr. Patel arrived late and left early. That was the first I'd heard of a changed timeline. Haroon Patel left before dessert. Yes, claimed he had a lab emergency. His absence went politely unmentioned. So he didn't see Carl collapse. Not directly, but he might have anticipated something. He seemed uneasy, distracted. He wasn't tasting so much as evaluating. I filed that away. You said Carl was under pressure. Did you know that beforehand, or see it on the night? Haycroft walked over to a side table, poured himself a glass of water with the kind of care usually reserved for aged cognac, and sipped. He wasn't his usual self. He explained every course, but without joy. The black walnut torte in particular. He hesitated before describing it, almost as if he were apologizing. That's a change from the menu, I said. He had something else planned for dessert. A fig tart with goat cheese. Only a few people noticed the switch. Lucia was one of them. Lucia notices everything, Haycroft said. That's her curse. Did she say anything about the change? She did not, but she tightened her fingers around her wine glass, so tightly I thought it might break. Then she smiled and told Carl it was a brave deviation. That's not praise. That's a warning shot. I let the silence stretch. Haycroft didn't fill it. Men like him consider unnecessary speech a form of cultural erosion. You've worked with Carl before? I asked finally. Yes. He catered a benefit 2 years ago. The food was impeccable. The budget was aggressive. He was uncompromising, but never unstable. Do you think this was a breakdown or a setup? Haycroft considered, his pale grey eyes steady on mine. What happened wasn't spontaneous. It was choreographed. You could feel it. Something had been arranged to break him. Why? Because genius without control is threatening. Carl was too confident, too singular, and someone wanted to show him he wasn't invincible. Any guesses who? Haycroft set down his water glass and walked to a bookshelf, finger trailing across the spines. The question is not who wanted to break him. The question is who had the precision to do it at the exact moment it would matter most. He plucked a book, The Art of Framing, and held it loosely in one hand. The black walnut torte was a frame, and someone inserted a portrait Carl hadn't painted. That made 2 people using the word framed, and one of them curated 6,000-year-old mosaics for fun. I left him standing there with his philosophical metaphors and took a cab back to the brownstone. Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, which meant I had 20 minutes to piece things together before he demanded I report with surgical accuracy. I poured myself a glass of milk, sat at the desk in the front room, and stared at my notes. Carl Mancuso had planned a specific menu. At some point, he changed the dessert. Or someone changed it for him. Either way, the black walnut dish wasn't just out of character. It was the trigger. Everyone else saw it too. Lucia reacted. Nadia noticed. Joyelle remembered his hand, trembled. Brasher said the table shifted. And then there was Patel, late arrival, early exit, no direct witness to the collapse. No comment so far. By the time Wolfe came down, sleeves rolled, smelling faintly of loam and temperance, I had the threads lined up. Report, he said, settling into the chair with his usual contempt for modern urgency. Haycroft confirms the atmosphere was tense, says Patel left before dessert. Joyelle hinted that Carl muttered something to Lucia just before walking out. Nadia says the dessert was a departure from plan, and only Lucia reacted to the switch. And Brasher thinks everyone had motive, but only one person had proximity. Lucia. Lucia. Wolfe nodded. And Carl? Still hasn't spoken. Still holed up in his apartment. We need access. Wolfe said. The moment has come for Saul. I picked up the phone and dialed the number I knew by heart. Saul Panzer, discreet, brilliant, and capable of infiltrating a locked wine cellar during a blackout with nothing but a toothpick and a jazz record. When he answered, I gave him the basics. I need eyes on Carl Mancuso, I said. Confirm he's alive, silent, and not being manipulated. Any movement restrictions? Number, but keep it subtle. We don't want him bolting. I'll call in 6 hours, Saul said and hung up. Efficient, as always. Wolfe closed his eyes again, hands resting on the arms of the chair like a judge in contemplation. They rehearsed something, he said softly. A group, or a pair. It required precision, timing. The dessert is central. What about Patel? I want him here, Wolfe said. Tomorrow. Use whatever means necessary, short of kidnapping. I didn't ask what he meant by necessary. I had my ways. A few promises, a bluff about Lucia seeking legal counsel, and Dr. Harun Patel agreed to visit the brownstone at 11 sharp. Something in his tone suggested he was more curious than concerned. Wolfe didn't open his eyes again that evening, but as I stood, ready to leave for the night, he said, Archie. When a man is silenced by a dish, the question is not what he tasted, it's what he recognized. I paused in the doorway. Recognized? Yes. A flavor, a gesture, a message. You think Lucia sent him a message through the dessert? I think, Wolfe said. She didn't have to. Someone else did, and he knew who it was the moment the spoon hit his tongue. I turned out the lights and left Wolfe in the dark, still and silent, just like Carl. The only difference was Wolfe would wake up knowing more, and if we were lucky, tomorrow Patel would say something that cracked the whole table open. Dr. Harun Patel arrived precisely at 11, as promised. He wore a charcoal-gray jacket with the air of someone who hadn't decided whether this was a social courtesy or a surgical consultation. I met him at the door and led him in. He took in the brownstone with quiet interest, his eyes scanning the woodwork, the layout, the geometry of things, like someone evaluating brain scans for anomalies. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He remained in his chair, motionless except for one finger rhythmically tapping the armrest. I made the introductions, then left them suspended in a moment of silence long enough for Wolfe to assess the man. You were at the chef's table, Wolfe said, his tone neutral and dry as unbuttered toast. You left early. I had an emergency, Patel replied. His voice was soft, deliberate. A call from the lab. You are a neuroscientist. Yes. My lab monitors long-term neural response to artificial taste stimuli. Wolfe opened his eyes. A fitting man to have at a meal designed to disrupt. Patel gave a slight smile. Carl invited me for that reason. He was fascinated by the way we process expectation, how taste, memory, and emotional residue intertwine. You left before dessert, Wolfe said. Was that planned? I hadn't intended to, Patel admitted. But something unsettled me. A tension around the table, the way Lucia and Carl danced through the courses. Too formal, too exact. I had the feeling I was witnessing a performance with an invisible script. Wolfe leaned forward half an inch. That, for him, was a thunderclap. Did Carl speak to you? Privately? Yes, just before service began. He asked me if the brain could unlearn a flavor. Unlearn? As in forget. Not just dislike. Erase a taste from memory so completely it no longer exists. Wolfe's eyes glinted. What did you tell him? That I didn't know. And his response? He said, then I'm ruined. I felt that one in my chest. Patel continued. It sounded metaphorical, but he was agitated, as if someone had served him a memory he couldn't bear to recognize. Had you tasted the dessert? Number 1 left during the cheese course. Wolfe was silent for a full 10 seconds. Patel didn't fill it. He seemed entirely comfortable with quiet, a man used to the hush of labs and the weight of internal thoughts. "Doctor," Wolfe said at last, "was Carl afraid of someone at that table?" "I think he was afraid of everyone, but mostly of himself." Wolfe closed his eyes again. "Thank you. That will be all for now." I escorted Patel to the door. Before leaving, he said something I hadn't expected. "If he doesn't speak again, you'll need to find the moment he stopped being a chef and started being a witness. That's where your answer lies." When I came back in, Wolfe was already scribbling notes, which was his way of screaming into a pillow. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down opposite him. "He wanted to forget something," I said, "and someone made him remember it." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "He served a dish that shouldn't have existed, a flavor never meant to be tasted again, either by himself or by someone else at that table." I thought it through. Lucia noticed the change first. Nadia knew it deviated from the plan. Haycroft saw her grip her glass. Joyelle called the moment a collapse. Brasher said the table shifted. And yet none of them reacted like Carl. "No," I said, "because it wasn't meant for them. That dish was a message to Carl. But from who?" Wolfe pressed his fingers together. "Saul has returned." Right on cue, the front door opened without ceremony. Only 2 people in New York can do that without getting a bullet, and one of them's Fritz. Saul Panzer entered, dropped his coat over the chair back, and nodded to Wolfe. "He's there," Saul said. "Carl. Not speaking, not writing. He hasn't left the apartment since the dinner. Refuses visitors except his sous chef. Eats only pre-prepared meals. Looks like he's waiting for something, or hiding from it." "Did he react to your presence?" Saul shook his head. "I didn't engage, just watched. But he's alert. His eyes follow movement. He's not catatonic. He's coiled." "Thank you, Saul. That confirms it," Wolfe said, as if he'd just heard the closing argument in a case only he could understand. "Confirms what?" I asked. Wolfe exhaled deeply. "That Carl Mancuso did not break. He witnessed. He understood. I stood. So it wasn't the food that poisoned him." "No," Wolfe said. "It was the memory the food evoked. A memory tied to someone present." Saul glanced at the desk. "You know who?" "Nearly," Wolfe said, "but I need a catalyst." I raised an eyebrow. "A confrontation." Number A reenactment. I looked at him like he'd lost the last working cell in his brain. "You want to recreate the dinner?" "Yes, here." I gaped. "Wolfe, you want 6 volatile suspects back in this room, with Carl silent and paranoid, Lucia calculating, and one of them potentially dangerous, all sitting around our table." "No," Wolfe said. "They will sit. I will remain seated as ever. You will serve." Saul smirked. He's serious. Wolfe closed his eyes again. "Of course I'm serious. This is theater. It began as theater. The final act belongs to me. Do we have Carl?" "Saul will persuade him." Saul nodded once. "He'll come. If I bring the dessert." "The original or the replacement?" I asked. Wolfe opened his eyes, sharp as blades. "Both." That night we began the preparations. Fritz, equal parts horrified and honored, agreed to attempt the replication. Nadia's investment ensured we got the original recipe drafts through a back channel. Saul arranged for Carl's sous chef to deliver samples of the final serve dish: black walnut, mascarpone, ghost truffle vapor. I didn't sleep. I never do when Wolfe plans a gathering. The suspects don't know it, but when they sit around Wolfe's office, they're already trapped. Each word is weighed, each glance recorded. And this time, it wouldn't just be observation. It would be memory. Resurrected. Served cold. The poison wasn't in the plate, it was in the past. And tomorrow night, we'd taste it again. The next morning began with Wolfe refusing his eggs and declaring that only a maniac would attempt 2 desserts before breakfast. Fritz took the blow with a martyr's grace and retreated to the kitchen, where he would spend the day replicating a tort he personally despised. I spent mine coordinating the slow, reluctant return of 5 people to a table they probably wished they'd never seen. Lucien Brasher required promises about lighting and seating. Joyelle insisted she bring her own wine. Nadia wanted a guarantee that no media would be present, which made Wolfe snort so loud I had to hold the receiver away from my ear. Gordon Haycroft asked if we would be serving on museum-quality china, and Lucia, when I told her Carl would be there, simply said, "Of course, I never doubted it," and hung up. Carl was the only true question mark, but Saul handled him like he was coaxing a wounded hawk down from a ledge. No words, no threats, just the sous chef, the dessert, and the promise that he'd be there for observation only. Carl agreed on one condition: he would not speak. Not a word. By 6 p.m., the table was set in the front room. Wolfe's office had been cleared except for chairs, Fritz's culinary theater, and the presence of Wolfe himself, anchored in his throne like a high priest waiting to read out omens and crumbs. The replica table matched the original dimensions of Le Carniere's chef's table, down to the number of settings and the exact course progression. Wolfe insisted on it. Fritz, despite muttering about insulted walnuts and culinary heresy, had recreated both desserts with terrifying precision. The originally planned fig tart with saffron tuile, and the substituted black walnut torte with mascarpone cream and the infamous ghost truffle vapor. Both sat under silver domes, untouched, waiting. The guests arrived in silence. I took coats, offered drinks, and received 5 wary glances in return. No one asked questions. No one made small talk. They knew Wolfe's reputation. They'd heard about these gatherings. They knew that once you crossed into the office, nothing was casual. Carl came last. He entered wearing black from collar to cuff, his hair longer, eyes dull, movements slow. But when he saw the table, something sharpened in his gaze. He stopped for one full breath, then took his seat without a word. Lucia sat directly across from him, her posture perfect. Brasher to her right, swirling his wine. Joyelle at the far end, sipping something orange and indifferent. Nadia and Haycroft flanked the ends of the table. Wolfe sat behind it all, looming without standing, speaking without needing to raise his voice. "You are here," Wolfe said, "because one of you sent a message through flavor, one that Carl Mancuso understood so completely, so intimately, that it silenced him. It was not the taste, it was the memory the taste invoked." No one moved. "This meal," Wolfe continued, "was designed to manipulate, not the palate, but the psyche. Carl planned one final course. It was replaced, not spontaneously, not in panic. It was replaced with something older, something precise. The black walnut torte. Fritz, on cue, lifted the silver dome to reveal the dessert. Its scent, earthy, faintly sweet, layered, began to fill the room. "I will not ask you to eat it," Wolfe said. "Not yet. But I will ask each of you, what does this remind you of?" Lucien Brasher chuckled. "The opening of a country club in Zurich. They served something like this between speeches about New World cuisine and old money." Joyelle raised her glass. "I remember a film wrap party in Marseille. The director had a pastry obsession. I wasn't sober, so that's all I've got." Nadia frowned. "A tasting menu in Vienna, 8 years ago. Too much truffle. No balance." Haycroft simply said, "I find it unpleasant. Like consuming a memory you didn't choose." Only Lucia said nothing. Wolfe turned to her. "Contessa." She met his eyes without blinking. "I remember the first time Carl made it. We weren't married yet. He made it as a challenge, for another chef. Carl didn't move, but I saw it. A flicker. Not in his eyes. in the way his fingers curled slowly against the edge of the table. "And who was that chef?" Wolfe asked. Lucia didn't answer. Instead, Wolfe turned to the second dessert. Fritz uncovered it. The fig tart, goat cheese ice cream already softening, a contrast in scent and form. This, Wolfe said, was Carl's planned finale. A delicate composition, but he did not serve it. He served the tort. Why? The silence grew weighty. Then Wolfe asked the question that tilted the room. "Carl, did you taste this dessert before?" Carl blinked slowly, then looked at Lucia, then at the tort, and then, for the first time in 6 days, he spoke. Yes. His voice was low, hoarse, but clear. Everyone froze. Lucia swallowed. "Where?" Carl kept his eyes on the tort. "Paris, in 2012, at the Black Apron. You made it." That was when the bomb dropped. All heads turned to Lucia. She didn't deny it. "I did," she said quietly. "It was mine." Wolfe's voice remained steady. "Carl believed he invented this dish, but it was hers." "I never claimed it after we married," Lucia said. "It was a private triumph. He adapted it, altered it, and served it. But it began with me." "You never told me," Carl said. "Not once." "You were building an empire," she said. "One flavor at a time. I didn't want to take that from you until—" "Until what?" Wolfe asked. Lucia looked around the table. "Until you stopped being honest with the food. Until the last few months, when everything became showmanship. You were starting to forget where it came from, where you came from. I didn't want to destroy you. I wanted to remind you." Carl shook his head. "You reminded me I was a thief." Wolfe spoke again. "You were not, but you were forgetful. The tort was not poison, it was provenance. And you, sir, reacted not to guilt, but to fear. Fear that your legacy was not yours alone." Nadia exhaled, sharp and low. "So this was about authorship?" Haycroft said. "Then it's no longer a crime." "No," Wolfe said. "But it was a wound, delivered with surgical precision." Lucia turned to Carl. "I only wanted you to stop pretending you invented everything you touched." Carl stared at the tort one last time. "I remember now," he said. "The night you served it. I thought I improved it, but it was never mine. Just borrowed, like everything else." Wolfe leaned back. "Then the memory has spoken. The poison was only truth. And truth, as always, exacts a cost." No one said anything. They didn't need to. One by one, the guests left, quieter than they'd arrived. Carl and Lucia remained seated, staring at the past plated in front of them. Wolfe closed his eyes. When Fritz cleared the table, he paused by Wolfe's chair. "Was it worth it?" Wolfe didn't open his eyes. "Always," he said. "A man's palate forgets, but not his pride." That night, the brownstone returned to silence, and for once, Wolfe skipped dessert. The next morning dawned gray and windless, the kind of New York day where the city forgets its volume knob and moves in a low, steady murmur. I came downstairs to find Wolfe already in his chair, awake, groomed, motionless. He hadn't rung for breakfast. Fritz, in a silent revolt, had placed a silver pot of coffee on the side table and disappeared. The black walnut tort, untouched, had been boxed and labeled in the refrigerator as Exhibit A. I poured myself a cup and waited. Wolfe didn't look at me. He was staring at a blank sheet of paper, not writing, just watching it like it might eventually betray a secret. "What's bothering you?" I asked. "The case is sold." Carl got his voice back. Lucia got her correction. The guests got their discomfort. And you got your performance. "That was not a solution," he said. "It was a restoration. We reconstructed the origin of a fracture. But we have not addressed what caused it to spread." I sat down and waited. Because when Wolfe went metaphysical, you either kept up or missed the real crime. There is still a manipulation we have not named, he said. I frowned. You mean Lucia? She was deliberate, yes, but not concealed. She wanted Carl to see the truth. She showed it to him plainly. What I'm speaking of is something subtler. I waited. Someone, he continued, anticipated Carl's reaction to the dessert and used it. Not to destroy Carl, but to use his collapse as a curtain to draw attention elsewhere. That put a chill in my neck. Draw it where? Wolfe reached for a note card from the evening before, one of the seating charts I had made. He tapped his finger on one name. Nadia. I didn't speak. I let the idea breathe. She came knowing the dessert would not be what was printed, Wolfe said. She identified the substitution faster than anyone but Lucia, and she was the only one who described the replacement in the language of opportunity. An investment check. She did say that, I admitted, but I thought she meant Carl. She did, Wolfe said, but not in the way she presented. What do you recall of Nadia's reaction when Carl collapsed? Controlled. She was surprised, but not startled. Precisely, Wolfe said. She wasn't reacting to the event. She was evaluating its impact. I stood and started pacing. So you're saying she didn't just witness the collapse, she counted on it. Wolfe nodded once. Carl's silence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum, Nadia stepped. With what? With access, Wolfe said. Control over the brand, the narrative, the recovery. A silent chef is a blank canvas, and Nadia paints with contracts. I thought about it. Nadia, who insisted the dinner stay out of the press. Nadia, who owned controlling interest in the La Carnière expansion. Nadia, who knew both Carl and Lucia well, enough to anticipate their dynamic and well enough to make use of it. She didn't poison the dish, I said. She poisoned the moment. Wolfe grunted. She allowed the existing fracture to widen. All she had to do was ensure the right dessert was served, a whisper to the sous chef. A quiet replacement, no fingerprints, but plenty of ink to sign documents afterward. I looked at the wall. Then we need Carl to say it. No, Wolfe said. We need him to see it. By noon, I had made the call. Carl agreed to return, this time without the others. Wolfe wanted him alone, uninterrupted. He arrived at 1:15, again dressed in black, but steadier now. When I let him into the office, he glanced around, half expecting another ambush. Wolfe gestured to the chair opposite. I want to ask you something, Wolfe said. Not as an investigator, but as a man who understands the burden of creation. Carl sat. His face was drawn, but alert. Did you choose to serve the black walnut torte that night? Carl was silent for a long moment. No, he said. I planned the fig tart, but the final version of the menu was changed while I was plating the 6th course. I didn't check it. I was distracted. Wolfe nodded. And you did not stop the service? Carl looked ashamed. I thought it would go unnoticed, or that I could justify it, but when I saw Lucia's eyes, when I tasted it, I knew what had happened. You believed she had done it, Wolfe said. Yes. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. She had not. Carl looked up. The substitution was made by someone else. Someone who knew your history with Lucia, knew the weight that dessert carried, knew that your reaction would be public, immediate, and irreversible. Carl's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. Nadia, she owns your silence, Wolfe said. She owns your future, and she made sure you delivered it to her, plate by plate. Carl stood slowly. She said she supported me, that this was just a moment. She supported the vacuum, Wolfe said. Not the man. Carl paced once around the desk. Then he stopped and looked Wolfe in the eye. What do I do? You reclaim it, Wolfe said. Publicly. Serve your dessert. Tell the story, the real one. I can't accuse her outright. You don't need to, Wolfe said. But you can discredit the lie and remove her reason for controlling you. Carl nodded. And Lucia? She will watch, Wolfe said, as always. And this time, she will see that you remembered. When Carl left, the room felt lighter. I stood by the desk and crossed my arms. You're letting him handle it. I have no need to expose Nadia, Wolfe said. Her method was elegant, almost admirable. But Carl's recovery is her unraveling. The moment he speaks, her investment becomes noise. So justice, Wolfe shrugged. Justice is often a quiet rebalancing. This one will come with caramelized figs and goat cheese. That night, Wolfe finally asked Fritz for dessert. It wasn't the torte. It wasn't the tart. It was a poached pear in white wine, modest and clean. Wolfe ate it without comment. Then he said, "The trouble with memory, Archie, is that it sweetens the wrong things." I leaned back in my chair. You think Carl will forgive Lucia? No, Wolfe said, but he will remember that she was the only one who reminded him of the truth. And in this house, that counts for something. The following afternoon, I found myself downtown, seated across from a woman who wore armor made of tailoring and a scent that cost more than my rent. Nadia Chervin had agreed to meet at her private tasting room, low lights, minimalist furniture, no mirrors, and greeted me with a smile so precise it could have been sliced from fondant. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "I assume this isn't social." "Not unless you brought dessert," I said. She offered a flicker of amusement. "I think we've all had enough of that." We danced around the small talk for a minute. Carl's health, the weather, whether truffles were over or timeless. And then I leaned forward, hands folded like I was about to suggest a partnership. "You swapped the dessert." There was no reaction, not from her eyes, not from her posture. Only the smallest pause, half a breath, before she answered. "I didn't touch a single plate." Didn't need to. The switch was in the menu file. You had access. You knew the significance of the dish. You knew Carl wouldn't question it in the moment, and you knew exactly how much weight that dessert carried, because you helped Lucia refine it in Paris. You were at that dinner too, weren't you? Her fingers brushed a wineglass stem, idle and precise. "I don't remember," she said. "Paris was full of experiments. Lucia had many ideas, but only one that Carl absorbed." She didn't flinch, just rotated the glass once. "Tell me, Mr. Goodwin, what exactly do you think I gained?" "Control," I said. "A narrative." Carl silenced himself. "You filled the void. You used that moment to solidify your claim on La Carnière. Investors, expansion, licensing. The story went from genius chef to shattered artist, and you, the stable hand, were ready to guide the brand." "Romantic," she said. "Calculated," I replied. She leaned back slightly. "And what happens now?" "That depends on Carl," I said. "He knows it wasn't Lucia who changed the menu. He knows what you did. He's speaking again." A pause. A long one. "I see," she said softly. "Then I imagine he'll want to reclaim something." "Already started," I said. "He's planning a new dinner. Public. 1 table. 1 course. His dessert, as he first intended it. The fig tart, and he's calling it Reclaimed." Nadia's lips tightened. "And you think that undoes me?" "I don't think you can be undone," I said. "Only exposed. And I think Carl's willing to do that quietly. But if you try to stop him..." She gave a soft laugh. "I wouldn't. The silence served its purpose." I stood. "For now," I said. "But be careful. Wolfe doesn't always let dessert settle. Sometimes he goes back for seconds." That earned a real smile. Sharp, white, amused. "Tell him I look forward to it," she said. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was knee-deep in records. Not legal ones, culinary ones. He had a collection of menus going back decades, filed and cross-referenced like police reports. He was revisiting every mention of black walnut torte in American haute cuisine from 1999 to the present. He looked up when I entered, and I gave him the summary. She won't challenge Carl. She knows it's over, but she'll wait for the next silence. As expected, he said. Some people don't cook, they ferment. Given time, they return stronger and more pungent. Fritz entered with a small plate. Slices of pear poached in red wine, garnished with a single curl of candied lemon. Wolfe tasted it, chewed, nodded. You spoke to Carl? Briefly, I said. He's focused, calm. He said something interesting. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. He said, I always believed flavor was invention, but memory makes it sacred. Wolfe put down his fork. He has learned, he said. Finally. That evening, the phone rang just after 10. I picked it up on the third ring. Mr. Goodwin, it was Lucia. I wanted to thank you. For what? For not pushing harder, for letting him speak in his time. I leaned against the desk. You knew he'd recover. No, she said, but I hoped he'd remember that I loved him through it. There was a pause. Then she said, he asked me to help him plate the dessert. I smiled. You going to? Of course, she said. It was mine once. Now it's ours. After the call, I walked back into the office. Wolfe had dozed off in his chair, one hand still resting on a half-finished index card. The brownstone was quiet. The night held steady. No footsteps, no phones, no contradictions. For once, everything had settled without shouting. A memory had been reclaimed. And justice, like dessert, had been served cold, but true. 2 days later, Carl Mancuso stood beneath a single pendant light in the back room of a converted wine cellar in Soho, dressed in the stark white of a chef's coat with the sleeves rolled high on his forearms. He wasn't speaking to press or photographers or guests. There weren't any. Just one table, 6 seats, and a single dessert waiting on the far counter, plated in complete silence. I sat against the wall, close enough to see the shine of the fig glaze, far enough not to intrude. Wolfe had declined to attend naturally. His appetite for symbolic gestures had a ceiling, and it began and ended at the edge of West 35th. But I was there for both of us. Lucia arrived first. No fanfare. She wore grey, not black, and no jewelry. She stepped to Carl without hesitation and kissed him lightly on the cheek. Then she took her seat. Brasher came next, asked no questions, muttered something about theatre in the kitchen, and sat with the look of a man expecting to critique a man's soul via pastry. Joyelle followed, camera in hand, though she took no photos. She simply looked slowly, as if trying to memorize the color of every tile. Haycroft entered with an envelope, handed it to Carl without comment, and sat beside Lucia. Carl didn't open it. When Nadia arrived, the room briefly chilled. She wore white, high-collared, and walked without hesitation. She looked at Carl, nodded once, and took the final seat. He nodded back. No warmth, no venom, just acknowledgement. A mutual recognition that the page had turned and they were no longer part of the same sentence. Carl walked to the counter, lifted a silver dome. The scent of figs and saffron spilled out with a quiet kind of grace, elegant, restrained, unmistakable. He served the tart to each of them, one by one. No sous-chef, no flourish, just a quiet placing of porcelain and a nod. When all 6 plates were down, he stepped back. Still no words. Lucia was the first to pick up her fork. The others followed. There was no applause, no conversation, only silence and tasting. For the first time in a long time, Carl was no longer performing. He was remembering. Afterward, he stood with his arms folded, watching, not seeking approval, only seeing if they understood. They did. I left as the guests began to disperse. Lucia lingered, still seated. Nadia left without speaking to anyone. Haycroft paused by the door to shake Carl's hand. Joyelle wiped her eyes discreetly, and Brasher, of course, scribbled into a small notebook, likely already crafting a metaphor about redemption served at room temperature. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the dining room with Fritz, both of them inspecting a delivery of white asparagus as if it were classified intelligence. Wolfe didn't ask what happened. He knew. Carl plated it himself, I said. Fig tart. No substitutions. No speeches. Did they taste it? They did, I said. And they understood what they were tasting, not just a dessert, a correction. Wolfe nodded once, barely perceptible. Then he is no longer silent. No, I said, and he isn't alone. Fritz cleared his throat delicately. I believe dessert is appropriate now. Wolfe waved him off. Later. We returned to the office, where Wolfe settled back into his chair and reached for a book he'd already read 3 times. I poured myself a drink and leaned in the doorway. She's staying, I said. Lucia, he asked her, to help relaunch the next menu. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. Good. She's calling it Memory and Mercy. Wolfe set the book on his lap. A fitting title. She told Carl, I added, that he was most himself when he forgot to be original. Wolfe's mouth twitched, which for him was the equivalent of a belly laugh. He will be fine, Wolfe said. Eventually, provided he doesn't let Nadia back in. She won't try. No, Wolfe agreed. She got what she needed. The silence. And she lost it. She won't overreach again. But she'll wait. They always do. I nodded. You think she'll strike again? Only if someone forgets the taste of being wounded. There was a long pause then. One of those rare silences in the brownstone that didn't feel like a pause, but a presence. A kind of hush that settled into the floorboards and told you something delicate had just ended. I looked at Wolfe. You going to eat the tart Fritz saved? I will, he said. Tomorrow. Why tomorrow? Because tonight, he said, someone else finally served it properly. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. The fig tart sat in the fridge, unclaimed. A dessert, a symbol, a memory. And for once, in the long ledger of our cases, we hadn't found a corpse. Just a wound that someone had finally stopped hiding from. The kind of justice Wolfe respects most. The quiet kind. The morning after Carl's quiet reckoning, the brownstone exhaled. There's no other way to describe it. The tension that had thickened the air for the past week thinned out like steam after a closed pot lid's been lifted. Fritz made orange popovers. Wolfe ate 3. That alone marked the case as closed. But I wasn't quite done. There was one thread still tugging. Not a loose end. Wolfe had tied the big ones into his usual neat bows, but something quieter, almost too small to notice unless you were listening for it. Joyelle. She hadn't said a word the night of the dessert, but her eyes had. They'd tracked Carl more than the tart. And that camera of hers, she never raised it, but she held it the entire evening like a talisman or a trigger, I couldn't tell which. So after breakfast, I called her. Mr. Goodwin, she said, her voice sharper than usual. I was wondering if you'd follow up. Then let me fulfill expectations, I said. You free? An hour later, I was seated across from her at a narrow midtown cafe with chairs too modern and espresso too bitter. She wore black this time, no scarf, no sunglasses, and the tiredness was no longer just in her eyes. It had reached her posture. I didn't bring the camera, she said before I could ask. Didn't feel right. Not your kind of story, I asked. She stirred her drink without sipping. It's not mine to tell, not fully. But you knew it, I said. The night of the collapse. You saw it coming. She didn't deny it. I saw Lucia's face, she said finally, and I saw Carl's hand tremble before he even tasted the tort. The collapse wasn't from surprise, it was the confirmation. Confirmation of what? Joyelle looked away toward the window where a pigeon flapped awkwardly across the street. Of something he'd known for years, that someone else had written a page in his origin story and he'd torn it out and signed his name over the whole. You mean Lucia's dessert? No, she said. I mean Lucia herself. That stopped me. Joyelle leaned forward. Carl didn't just borrow a recipe. He borrowed belief. Her belief in him, her palate, her timing, her taste. For years. She didn't teach him to cook, but she taught him how to mean it. And the tort? That was just the flavor of what he'd buried. You're saying he didn't just forget her contribution, he erased it. Joyelle nodded. Not out of malice, out of fear, of needing someone. And Nadia used that. She did. But Lucia forgave him before any of us sat down that night. That tracked. Lucia's stillness, her clarity. It wasn't vengeance. It was resolution. I sipped my espresso and winced. So why stay silent? Because the only confession that mattered was Carl's, she said. And he made it. Not with words. With the tart. We left it there. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was reading Horace and ignoring the doorbell. I opened it to find Saul Panzer standing there, clean coat, clipped tone. Thought you'd want this, he said, handing me a folded newsprint clipping. It was from a small culinary review column in The Observer, unsigned. A single plate, one tart, one table. Redemption doesn't need applause, just honesty, and sometimes a memory served warm with goat cheese. I took it to Wolfe. He read it, then handed it back. Joyelle? She didn't bring her camera, but she still wrote it. Wolfe grunted. There's no byline, I said. She never needed one, Wolfe replied. That was her confession? We sat for a while. Fritz's popovers cooled on the sideboard. Somewhere down the hall, the orchids turned toward the sun like they'd heard the news and approved. What's next? I asked. Wolfe closed the book in his lap. Dinner, he said. Not dessert. No, he said. Let the last one linger. That night, the brownstone was quiet. The city kept moving outside. Cars, sirens, shouts. But inside, we had stillness. And stillness, in Wolfe's world, is the most satisfying sound of all. The taste of resolution, it turns out, lingers longer than sugar. And it doesn't need a spoon. The morning light spilled unevenly through the tall windows of the brownstone, casting long, quiet shadows over the familiar clutter of books, orchids, and Wolfe's formidable chair. I sat across from him, nursing a cup of black coffee while he remained motionless, eyes half closed as if the world beyond his sanctum was an unwelcome interruption. This, Wolfe began at last, is the conclusion of an unusual case, one not of poison in the literal sense, but of poison born from memory, pride, and unspoken truth. I nodded, feeling the weight of the weeks behind us settle into a final stillness. Carl Mancuso's collapse was no accident, nor mere frailty, Wolfe continued, voice calm and deliberate. It was a carefully orchestrated unmasking. A dessert replaced not to harm the body, but to shatter illusions. The black walnut tort was a symbol, a message drawn from his past, one he buried under years of pride and borrowed glory. I remembered Lucia's silence, Nadia's calculating patience, Joyelle's quiet watchfulness, Brasher's sharp critiques, and Haycroft's cold assessment. Each had played a part in the slow dance around the truth, but none wielded the final blade. That belonged to memory itself. Lucia Varela did not poison Carl's food, but she challenged his authorship, reminding him that the dish, like their relationship, was a collaboration he had long forgotten to acknowledge. Wolfe's eyes flicked toward the orchids, delicate yet unyielding. Her act was harsh but necessary. And Nadia Chervin, she did not directly interfere in the kitchen, but she wielded influence with a surgeon's precision, ensuring Carl's silence served her ambitions, controlling the narrative and the brand while he was vulnerable. I thought about Carl, silent no more, reclaiming his voice with a single plate of fig tart. His own true creation, finally served as intended. Joyelle Hines witnessed more than anyone else, Wolfe added. Her quiet observations caught the fractures beneath the surface, emotional fissures no recipe could mask. Her words in the paper were the subtle confession that bound the threads. I glanced at Wolfe. So, justice? A quiet justice, he said, delivered not in courtroom spectacle, but in the restoration of truth. Carl's voice reclaimed, the false narratives dismantled, and the poison, memory's bitter sting, confronted and transformed. He paused, eyes fixed on a spot beyond me. This case, Archie, reminds us that the most dangerous poisons are not always those we taste, but those we refuse to acknowledge. Pride, betrayal, and forgotten debts. These linger long after the plate is cleared. I smiled, feeling the familiar mix of satisfaction and melancholy. Dinner's ready, Wolfe, I said. Popovers are waiting, and maybe this time you'll eat your dessert. He gave a rare, small smile. Perhaps, but only when the palate is ready to forgive. The brownstone settled back into its quiet rhythm. The mystery dissolved into memory, and as always, Wolfe reigned supreme, not by force, but by the precision of intellect and the justice of understanding. And me. I lit my cigar, poured one last cup of coffee, and waited for the next story to unfold.